All right, good evening, everyone, to this installment of YouTube live stream. Today, I'm very happy to welcome back a very good friend of ours, Dr. Richard Rubenstein. As you can see there, his book, When Jesus Became God. So we're going to have a little chat. This is the second time, I believe, a year ago or so, March. I think it was March last spring. How are you, Doctor?
Fine, thank you. Glad to be back.
Thank you for making the time tonight. And I hope you and your family are well during this recent pandemic.
Thank you, we are.
Okay, so we'll get started. Dr. Richard Rubenstein, in case you don't know, this is, we're going to begin with this book. That's how most of us in our little non-Trinitarian circle of believers know Dr. Rubenstein. He's a historian first. Is that right?
Yes.
And he wrote this book. Please get it on Amazon. It's called When Jesus Became God, The Struggle to Define Christianity During the Last Days of Rome. It's very educational, very fact-based. Like I said, he's a historian first. Dr. Rubenstein is also a professor of conflict resolution and public affairs at George Mason University, where he specializes in religious conflict. And Dr. Rubenstein is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, and he currently is in Fairfax. Are you still in Fairfax, Doctor?
We're in Arlington.
Arlington, okay.
Arlington.
Arlington, Virginia.
Yeah.
So we're going to, I'll start asking you some questions, like I said, about this book. And then what you're doing right now, you told me about, you're doing some work with the Apostle Paul. So, but before that, Doctor, I did not get to ask you this, I believe, in our first interview. Are you religious? Are you a practicing XYZ?
That's a hard question to answer. No, I think if it means am I a regular churchgoer or synagogue goer, I'm not really. I go when the Spirit moves me, and which is fairly often. But I'm not a member of a congregation.
So where do you go when you do go?
I go to a congregation on Capitol Hill where I live.
Sorry, I mean, Doctor, Christian or
No, this is a Jewish
Jewish?
synagogue.
Sir. Okay,
It's a liberal Jewish synagogue.
got it.
But when I think about that question, are you religious? It calls to mind the fact that I think people seek the fulfillment of all kinds of different needs through religion, and the one need in particular that I find myself drawn back all the time, either to the synagogue or to a church. My wife is a churchgoer, and I often go with her. Is the need to understand one's own values, and the need to discover a source of value. And that I mean, some people call it God, and some people, have other explanations for it. But the idea that a sense of values is not something that you reason your way to. That it involves a kind of moral conviction. And to me, it makes sense to talk about the source of that conviction being, in some sense, divine. So, I mean, we go to church or we go to synagogue for lots of reasons, including to express ourselves as a member of a community, including family relations, and so forth. But the thing that to me has kept me interested all this time is the basic concept that we human beings are not what we could be. We are potentially um, much better than the way we are now, than the way we act. Our society is potentially much more harmonious, much more fruitful, much happier than it is now. And our relations with other people, not only in our own families and in our own countries, but across the world, could be so radically better than they are now, that when I think about where the vision comes from of a radically better person and a radically better society and a radically better global community, that vision comes from religion. And so, after I wrote the book about when Jesus became God, the Arian controversy, I wrote a book called Thus Saith the Lord, which is about the vision of Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets, in which I talk about Jesus as a prophet as well. I find it interesting also that, in my field, which is conflict resolution, in which we have so many people who are interested in peace and justice, and if I ask them, where do you get these ideas about peace and justice? And they tell me, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution or whatever. And I find myself saying, no, that, the Enlightenment revived those, certain of those ideas, but the original source is in Judaism, and it's in Christianity. Also Islam. I mean, the Abrahamic religions in particular, it seems to me that that's the source of the ideas that, for me are the driving ideas really of my life, the ideas that make my life meaningful.
Right. Tell me, Professor, when you speak in churches about this book in particular, what type of reactions do you get from churchgoers? I think last time you told me you get some interesting feedback, either immediately after or during the Q&A or whatever. What are some of those?
Yes, well, I have to say, the first reactions that I get, people tend to be very interested and very friendly. There's not much hostility. And I make it clear when I speak in churches that I'm not trying to tell Christians how to be a Christian, but then the most interesting thing, I think we may have talked about this before, but the most interesting thing about it is that no matter what the church is and how orthodox it claims to be, when we talk about the Nicene Creed, when we talk about the controversy over the divinity of Christ, people come up and say, we never thought about this. They come up and say, we have always recited the Nicene Creed or some other creed, or we've talked about the Trinity, or, and we have just kind of recited words, but we never think about, and we're not often taught much about what they really mean and what the origins of these beliefs are. So they find it liberating, I think, just to be able to know that these matters were once the subjects of great controversy. And I think the reason that people feel somewhat liberated sometimes about this is because a lot of them have been thinking unorthodox thoughts, but haven't been able to express them or talk about them easily with other people. So I think I think they're happy to be able to talk. Sometimes it's better to be an outsider, you know. They're happy to be able to talk maybe with an outsider. I'm not going to interfere with their internal affairs, and they know that. Um, but the subject of Jesus and who he was, and what his life meant, and all of that is still very much on people's minds. It's a live subject.
Right. So the title is When Jesus Became God. And I'm sure most Christians who believe Jesus is God, has been God for all eternity, right? He's the second person of this Trinity. It might come as a shock, maybe, the title, if I were a Baptist or whatever, right? When Jesus became God. So have you been able to answer that question? I believe you do in this book, but can you tell us when did Jesus become God then?
Yes, in the year 381.
Three.
That
Tell us about the year 381,
well,
Doctor.
well, as you know very well, the year 381 was the year in which the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who was originally from Spain, a Spanish general, and who had came to power, and he came to power, and the situation which existed when he came to power was that for the preceding 60 years or so, from the early part of the 4th century until almost the end of the century, the Roman world was bitterly divided between Christians who believed that Jesus was the Son of God and the Messiah, and a uniquely holy person, but that he was not the same as God. He was not equal to God. That in some ways he was subordinate to God.
Now, Doctor, excuse me, but when we talk about God, who exactly are we talking to? So when you talk about God, and Jesus was not, he was related to God, but in other words, who is that? Who is the God you're speaking of?
The God that I'm speaking of is Yahweh, is the God of the Old Testament as well as the New, the one that Jesus called Father, and that Christians, Jews, and Muslims all call Father. The Creator, the source of all value, and for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the one God, the one God, supreme over all. So I think what's important to understand about this was that from the very beginning, when Jesus was proclaimed the Messiah by St. Paul and other figures, what that meant, most obviously, to the Jews who were his followers, and at the beginning, of course, they were all Jews. Then quite soon, they were more than that. They were people who were Greeks and members of other nations. But the people who followed Jesus, when they said that he was the Messiah, they understood that this meant that he was the person whose coming had been predicted by the prophets, and in particular Isaiah, who has the most most vivid and important predictions in some ways. And that his coming meant that the promises that God had made to Israel and also to all the nations would be fulfilled. That the world of the great empires that had dominated world society since the time of the Assyrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, that world was coming to an end. And that a different kind of empire, an entirely different kind of empire would be inaugurated. It would be announced by and led by the Messiah, who would then turn the control of it over to his Father, over to God. And that world would be characterized by simply by being, shall I say, achieving a level of justice and a level of personal fulfillment for people individually, but a level of social fulfillment, a level of justice and peace that the prophets had described, and that Jews had been expecting for several hundred years, even before Jesus appeared. There was a very rich apocalyptic literature. If you particularly look at the book of Daniel, but many other books as well, carrying out the predictions of the prophets, that there was going to be a great transformation, a great change. And this change, by the way, would not mean that time would stop. It wouldn't mean that some kind of science fiction world, would appear where all the laws of nature would be reversed and that sort of thing. It was a continuation of the world that we know, but radically better, radically changed. I mean, so radically that that sin and death would be conquered. So that that prophetic dream, if you like, was what people thought of when they said the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is here. That means this world is now about to become radically better. And the notion that the Messiah would be himself God was almost immediately controverted by a large number of Christians, and particularly the Christians who tended to live in the East, live in Palestine or live in Syria, live in the great centers of Antioch and Alexandria, the Greek-speaking world. They believed that they still felt connected with their Jewish past, and in some ways even with other aspects of the past of that civilization. They were a great civilization, and they did not believe that it made sense to talk about Jesus the Son and Jesus the Father being the same, being the same entity. That they were both divine, yes, but that they were identical or equal in stature, no. This view then was challenged in the beginning in the 320s of the modern era. This view was challenged by Christians, many of whom lived in the West, in Western Europe, and the most important figures lived in Alexandria, Egypt. It was challenged by people who were saying, no, if Jesus is divine, he must be God himself. One of the reasons I wrote the book, When Jesus Became God, aside from just interest in the subject, was to try to determine why this controversy would become so bloody, and why it would really tear the empire apart for 60, 70 years, resulted cities being burned down. You know, Constantinople was burned as part of this controversy. There were people assassinated. Lots of people lost their jobs. And so that's that. What concerned me as a conflict resolution specialist, in particular, was why would people who disagreed about the relationship of the Father to the Son, which seems like a pretty abstract, you know, kind of a hair-splitting theological controversy, why would they assassinate each other, or why would they have riots, which they did, major riots about it? And I think it really had to do with the vision that people had, what they felt they needed in their own lives, what they felt the society needed, and the vision that they had of the kind of Jesus whom they wanted to relate to. In particular, the people who lived in the East were the heirs to a tradition in which in some ways was intensely optimistic, which believed that with the great transformation that was about to occur in society, but also in people's hearts, that Jesus could serve them as a model, that they could imitate him, that they could, even though they might not be sinless, they could get a lot closer to that ideal. And that they could live living a Christian life would mean living a life radically different from the kind that they had lived before under the old empires, the power worshiping, violence worshiping empires. They tended to view Jesus as a, shall I say, as a beloved brother, as a not a man like every other man, not simply a particularly a spiritually talented guy. More than that, but still close enough to humanity to serve as a kind of moral for a radical moral improvement of people. And the opposition, which was led by Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, the people who wanted Jesus basically to be God himself, were more in the position of saying, and particularly as time went on, this became clearer and clearer. They were more in the position of saying, we need a God who will be he fulfill the messianic role, but he'll also be our judge. We are sinners, and we can't really aspire to be a lot like Jesus. What we need is a church to protect us. What we need is to learn to live with the likelihood that society is not going to get much better than it is now, and that only a few of us who may become monks or adepts, holy people, saints, adepts, will be super holy, but most of us are not going to make that. And so this more pessimistic view of the potential of people to develop morally, and the potential of society to develop into a more peaceful and just place, that kind of pessimism gets reflected in saying we want let's have Jesus be in heaven and not be the elder brother who is going to help us live a new kind of life. So I don't want to exaggerate this, because there, and people on both sides of this controversy, there are there were complicated views on both sides of the controversy. But one thing that becomes clear is that as the Roman Empire gets in more and more trouble, and during the years of the controversy that we're talking about, the Arian controversy, named after Arius, who was a priest in Alexandria, these were also years of great trouble for Rome, of the decline of the empire, where, interestingly enough, the empire is starting to show kinds of vulnerability, both internal and external. It's getting invaded from outside forces, but also it's developing terrible internal problems, poverty, inequality, plagues, I may say. And
Doctor, if I could just pause you for a minute. In your book, you talk a lot about the, quote, Nicene forces versus the Arian group, right? Now, as far as my history goes, we don't really know what Bishop Arius believed. We only get whatever he believed or whoever he was from the point of view of his enemies, as it were.
That's right.
So, can you tell us a little bit about the Arians? What was an Arian, and what can we know for sure about the historical figure known as Arius, the bishop?
Yeah, well, I must say we don't know a lot. We don't know a great deal about him, and it's kind of hard to know a great deal about anybody in this period. People were not generally writing autobiographies and and so forth. They weren't being covered by the media. But Arius was a priest who had come through the period of persecution and had made a tremendous reputation in Alexandria, because when the Romans were persecuting Christians, the Christian world was divided between people who basically collaborated with the Romans and people who refused to collaborate and accepted martyrdom, and people who managed to avoid martyrdom but also didn't collaborate. And Arius was one of those. The word traitors comes from traditores. Those were the Christian priests and bishops who handed over, traditores, Latin for handing over. They handed over the precious things of the church and documents and so forth to the Romans in order to save their own lives. Well, Arius was apparently extremely brave. He risked his life again and again and again. So he came out of this with a reputation for being a spiritual heavy and very courageous. He was also a poet, and he put his beliefs to music. And one of the things that disturbed his enemies a lot was that his songs were being sung all over the Middle East, and they were songs about Jesus being the holiest person who ever lived, maybe, but someone that we could relate to. So that there was the positive side of Arianism, which emphasized Christ's sacrifice, his teachings about what the good society should look like, his teachings about what a moral person should act like. But then there was the negative side, if you want to look at it that way, which insisted that Christ was a creation of God. He was the firstborn, the Son, the Messiah. But all of those terms imply that God created him, so that he was not uncreated, which was a word that the theologians talked about in those days a lot. He was not uncreated like God. He was a creation, and therefore, in some respects, inferior to God, closer to, or to put it differently, closer to humans than God. This Arianism, I mean, Arius died very young, and there are still rumors about how he died. I mean, there's still controversies about how he died. He died of an intestinal problem, which some commentators have said sounds a whole lot like poison. And so we don't know whether he was done away with or whether he became ill. But he died quite young. And the movement that took his name, the movement then that started then was a kind of a large movement in which there were conservatives and liberals and radicals, as there are in any big either theological or political movement. And so there were then disagreements among the Arians, as there were among the Nicene Christians, amongst themselves, as to over questions of, well, how much like God was he? And in what ways in particular was he like God? I'll give you an example of that. Some Arians said, and I think Arius also, one of his songs suggests this too, that he was sinless, that Jesus was sinless because he resisted temptation and because he basically conquered the tendency to sin. He wasn't created sinless. And so the question was, well, could he have sinned? Might he have sinned? And the Arian answer was certainly. If he hadn't been human enough to have sinned, he wouldn't have been able to conquer the tendency to sin. But to people on the other side of the debate, theologically, this was a kind of heresy, because their idea was Jesus was created. Since Jesus was God, of course he was sinless. So, another interesting thing I just wanted to mention to you quickly, Carlos, was that I'm very happy for people to read my book, but this controversy did not stop. I mean, when Jesus became God, you asked me the question, and I said 381, which was when the Emperor Theodosius pulled an ecumenical conference together, and that declared that the Arians were heretics, and that basically declared that the Trinity was going to become the doctrine of Christianity, the official doctrine of Orthodox Christians. But that didn't end the controversy. The Arians, after a while, disappeared. It took them a couple of hundred years to disappear. They disappeared for a while. But the Christians then, the theologians, and the people, because we're talking about a society in which people got very involved in theological issues. This theology was kind of the politics of that era. And people got involved in even ordinary people got involved in these discussions a lot. So the discussions then became, well, if Jesus is both God and man, how many natures does he have? Does he have just a God nature, or is he a human nature? And are those natures in conflict? And if they're not in conflict, how does that work? And these controversies that continued causing ecumenical councils that would come down on one side or the other side of the issue. This went on for another 200 years. There's a very good book about it. There's Philip Jenkins has a book about it called The Jesus Wars, which is about the period after the period that my book is about. It's extremely well done description of this bitter controversy, which it so tore Christianity apart that when the Muslims finally invaded, the Eastern Mediterranean in the 7th century, starting in the 7th century, people were, oh, there you have it, good. People were so tired of these controversies that one reason that the Muslims said, look, there's just one God, and Jesus was one of his prophets, and that's settled. And a lot of people said, good, let's go.
Right.
We get to, so.
Yeah, I love this book. This is another great book. I love the subtitle there. How 4 patriarchs, 3 queens, 2 emperors decided what Christians would believe for the next 1500 years. That's such an ironic sort of heading there, because you would think that the Bible, specifically the New Testament, would tell us Christians what to believe.
Right.
There's also a book called 381, Doctor. I forget the author. It's just, is it Freeman?
Yeah, Charles Freeman.
Yes, 381. What do you make of that book? Have you?
He's a very good historian.
Yeah, so this is another book, AD 381, Heretics, Pagans, and the Christian State. Another excellent read. Let me ask you, Doctor, to go back to the Arians. In your book here, you say on page, I believe it's 179, that Arians had a capacity, quote, to tolerate a variety of theological perspectives without declaring their opponents agents of the devil, and their modest disinclination to claim knowledge of matters beyond human understanding, like the precise relationship between the Father and the Son.
Yeah.
Why do you think, from your research, that the Arian group it sounded like they were more tolerant of their fellow Christians who disagreed on the father-son relationship, and it sounds like the Nicene group, headed by Athanasians, were totally the opposite. It sounded like they were real sort of gangster. I mean, that's the sort of impression I get.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that, there are 2 answers that come to mind. One is that the Aryans were more in touch with a kind of tradition of debate and a tradition of inquiry in places like Antioch, in particular, Antioch was maybe the greatest center of theological learning for a long time. And a very, shall I say, it's a very diverse society. Also a very wealthy society. I mean, it's also good to remember that there were 1 million people in Alexandria, 500,000 in Antioch. That this was the center of trade of the Roman world at a time when places like France and England were basically forests. This was really the center of civilization. And there was a tradition going back to the Jewish past and the pagan past also, of people debating these things and talking to each other about them, changing their minds sometimes and so forth, and not much emphasis on heresy, and not much emphasis on the need for kind of uniformity, and not much book burning. That all of this kind of comes into existence really with the defeat of the Arians. And I think part of the reason maybe is that the influence of the West becomes stronger. But also, I think it has to do with the fact that that the questions that are being decided are what kind of Christianity, what kind of Christianity will be appropriate for the religion that will become the state religion of the Roman Empire. Because when Jesus becomes God, if I said, but in answer to your question before, 380, 381, that's also the year when Christianity becomes the state religion. And Theodosius is really the first of the emperors to punish the pagans for being pagans, to shut down pagan churches and pagan shrines, and all of that. A kind of violent guy, actually. You know, he had 7,000 people killed in Thessalonica for attending for being rowdy at a meeting. He got angry at them, and he had 7,000 people. At any rate,
typical Roman emperor, huh?
well, you know, if you look at the history of, revolutions, I mean, Christianity was a religious revolution, and when it becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, then it becomes an agent of authority. And the Romans want to use it to bring law and order to the empire. And they're not interested in debating, especially debating important matters. So there's some comparison. People have made a comparison between Theodosius and a figure like Stalin, who brings an end to the debate among the socialists in Russia, a bloody end to the debate. Or similar figures, Cromwell, in England. So this is really the tragic side of this is a tragic side.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Professor, about the 380 and the 381 creeds, really. So I'll just show this for the audience sake. So you talked about the Edict of Thessalonica, and let me bring it up here if I could. Now I have a burning question about this. So this is Wikipedia. It's so this edict, it says, it was a rule of law from the state by 3 reigning Roman emperors. One of them was this affirmation Theodosius.
Yeah.
Now, I asked you the first time we spoke, where was the church council that was Trinitarian? In other words, giving us what we now understand to be the doctrine of the Trinity. And I believe you said they were none. The councils usually were debating about the father-son relationship. Now, I have a question about this. So they put this edict out, this order out, before 381, a year before. And it says in part, according to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe in the one deity of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, a holy Trinity. Now, this fascinates me because then, like you said, Theodosius convenes another council the next year. And like the Nicene Council, as you see here, the language stays pretty much the same in terms of defining the one God. And we believe in one God, the Father. So it's not, we believe in one God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Why the difference as far as your research is concerned? What do you think in other words, why did the Council of 381 not reflect the clear Trinitarian, what became Trinity language of 380?
Well, the answer is, I don't know. I can guess. I can make a few guesses about it. One answer is that that Theodosius had become close to Gregory, one of the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nyssa. had become the Metropolitan Bishop of Constantinople at the same time that Theodosius was becoming emperor. They seem to have been close. So he was probably listening to or channeling Gregory, and Gregory was one of the original Trinitarian theorists. A brilliant guy, by the way, but who had invented this whole new language to try to explain how you could have three in one. So I think, partly second reason is that Theodosius was just speaking for himself, and Gratian and, the other emperors, although he was the number one guy. He was speaking for himself. And then when he did the council, I think he felt he was, for one thing, he was bound to some extent by Nicaea. He couldn't just toss Nicaea out, since his own faith was Nicene. And there also may have been an effort there to try to convince the Arians to come over, because there are reports, several of the historians have reported that there, in addition to anathematizing them and trying to stamp them out, there were also attempts to have dialogues with them. And so I think he may have thought that if he was a little softer, in the phrasing, in the Nicene, the Constantinople, creed, that he might have been able to bring them over. He still may have been hoping to bring them over voluntarily, because he was also threatening them with all kinds of punishment if they didn't come over. But some people who knew him said that he really didn't like punishing people for religious reasons if he could avoid it. And so I think maybe he was trying to, that's the best I can do with that. It's a very good question. I don't know what the answer.
I think you're right. I think we talked about, in your book, you talk about the very sort of political machinations, really, of the councils, where they're trying to come up with words and terms to please everyone. So we can just sign this thing and bring some peace and stability. So it was very much, sounds very political, the Christian, so-called Christian councils. So let me ask you this. You start in your book with a horrible story of a riot in Alexandria and a poor guy called George of Cappadocia, who is a bishop there, and he's dragged, literally a mob of other Christians dragged this man out, beat him, and kill him. That's how the book starts. So
Right.
Can you imagine how shocked a little Baptist kid or something would be? Let me ask you this, doctor, and this is a rather difficult question. I hope you can give me your opinion. There is a claim today that survives to today that the decisions and actions of these councils, right, were guided by the Holy Ghost. I believe that most of the councils, the leaders of the councils, the directors, they started by praying, very piously, and saying, using the New Testament language, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to come to these decisions and so forth. So there's this notion that survives today that these councils were guided by the Holy Spirit. And if we read the New Testament especially, we know the fruits of the Holy Spirit, right? Self-control, love your enemy, and all this. So how true was that? Is that true? That sort of, I believe it's a more Eastern Orthodox position nowadays, that the councils were guided by that sort of spirit of loving and and so on.
Well, if the councils were guided by the Holy Spirit, then the Holy Spirit must have been at war with itself, because if you count up the councils, just on the Arian controversy alone, before you get all into all the stuff that Jenkins talks about later, I counted 65 councils between between the years 320 and 380. In 60 years, there are more than 60 councils. And if you say, well, how did the councils come out? Well, it all depended on who was at the council and who had called the council, and most importantly, who was emperor at the time of the council. Because the Emperor Constantine, who called the original council in Nicaea, was succeeded by his son Constantius, and Constantius was an Arian. And Constantius was succeeded by somebody who was a Nicene. And so it went back and forth, so that finally, when Theodosius appears at the end, as we were talking about, he's a kind of militant Nicene Christian. But right before that, the emperor right before him was Valens, who was an Arian. So, and Valens, by the way, called probably the largest and most ecumenical of all the councils, was one that was held simultaneously in Italy and Greece. It was the Council of Rimini Seleucia, and there were hundreds and hundreds of bishops there, and that was a totally Arian council.
Did you say that was the biggest attended council?
Yeah, that was like, because if you put them all together, I think there was something like 600, 700 people in attendance, church officials in attendance. So what had happened was, I think you're absolutely right to say that that this became a search for a form of words that would somehow please everybody. But then also at a certain point, they didn't care about pleasing everybody. They wanted their own views to be to be legitimated. And so the Council of Nicaea itself was really not ecumenical at all. I mean, it was practically all of the delegates to that council came from from a few countries, and it was not a very large council. Lots of people just didn't come at all.
So the biggest council, here's a Wikipedia article if anyone's interested. It says 300 to 400 bishops.
Yeah.
So the biggest of the known councils actually came away with an Arian creed.
Yes.
So that Jesus was not fully God or true God or whatever.
Yeah.
Do we know, Professor, I have heard that overall there were more than 200 councils of various sizes. Do we know the number of overall councils, earliest councils from, I don't know, up to the 8th century or something?
Offhand, I don't, but there were, I'm sure, hundreds.
Hundreds?
At least hundreds.
Yeah, we could say hundreds.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was, I think when you read these things, you sort of have two reactions to them when you read about them. One is a certain admiration for the fact that they are willing to talk to each other about these issues, debate them, and try to come to some decision without getting a lot of people killed.
Right.
So this was not like the whatever number of Congress of the Congress of the party sort of thing. This was the result of many of these councils was that people who had been bishops were thrown out of their sees, or new bishops were appointed. That there was a reshuffling of the church hierarchy, but still widespread violence was avoided for a long time, and most of the violence that did occur took place in the street because people were really excited about their team, if you like.
Mm.
Um,
Actually, Professor, the article here has an interesting line. It says the council was considered a defeat of Trinitarianism.
oh
And
yeah,
then, and then they have a quote attributed to St. Jerome.
yeah,
The whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian. And you know that quote very well.
I do. And it's a little bit disingenuous that because nobody was astonished. I mean, Arianism was a major, a major tendency in Christian thinking, so it would not be astonishing.
Let me follow that up, Doctor. You said you talked about the Jewish Messiah, the expectation of the Jewish Messiah. So this was a figure that was obviously closely tied to the one God of Israel, a special agent, if you will, handpicked. But it sounds like the Jewish Messiah view is not the view of modern day Christians of Jesus, the Messiah, as the second person of the Trinity. So as we know, the early Christian movement was majority Jews, right? I think we tend to forget that the first Christians were mostly Jews.
Right.
They were not Gentiles. We slowly crept into the thing. So tell me about that distinction there, that sort of conflict with the Jewish view of the Messiah and what we now have, where this Jesus is now the second person of the Trinity. And what did that do to that view you were talking about from the prophets of the Old Testament, the Isaiah view of peace on earth and all this being brought through that figure, that Mashiach, that anointed one of Yahweh of the Old Testament?
Yes, well, I think it's maybe good to start out just by recognizing that in ancient days, and for a long time, and in some ways in modern days as well, but in ancient days, there was not so much of a clear distinction between the divine and the human. There's the writer Karen Armstrong has talked really beautifully about this fact that 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 people could be closer or farther from God, and people could contain in their own personalities and their own lives, their own spiritual development, more or less of God. That there was never it was never a question of saying, well, he's so and so is so holy, he must be God himself. People would not say that because, at least in a monotheist culture, that would be an impossibility. But to say that if you say that somebody is not God, that doesn't mean that they don't have a certain measure and maybe a very great measure of divinity. So that that's clear from the Old Testament to begin with, that when Elijah dies, God takes him up to heaven he's assumed into heaven because of his special relationship with. He had a special relationship with God. Jeremiah says, God called me to be his prophet in the womb when I was not even born. A kind of pre-existent idea, So if you say if a Jew say a follower of Paul or one of the other apostles in the early days of Christianity, says, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, he's the Christ, that means it means a couple of things. One, as I said before, it means that the new age is starting, has begun. It also means that he is going to be in a special way God's representative. That the Davidic Messiah was going to be the liberator of Israel, and also the person that would inaugurate the kingdom of God, and bring the truth of that kingdom to the nations. So you have there's a high degree of, shall I say, there are some people that have special relationships with God in the Old Testament as well. And so it would not be shocking, in particular, to somebody who to a Jew of Jesus's generation, for somebody to say, if somebody said, well, he's the Messiah and the new age has begun, the answer might be, well, I don't think somebody might say, well, I don't think he is. Or I have reasons to, my interests don't lie in allowing myself to think that he is. But it would not be heretical to be from a Jewish point of view. It would not be. It might be a mistake to think that he was the Messiah, but it wouldn't be a heresy to think that he was the Messiah, because, among other things, you're not saying that he's God on earth. You're saying that he's God's representative.
That's what the title Messiah, very Jewish, Mashiach, means or meant. But now, as you know, visiting churches, when you talk about your book, now it seems that those very Jewish titles, Jewish Christian titles of Messiah and Son of God in particular, Professor, from our perspective, it sounds like they have been redefined to mean something else. So when Christians talk about Son of God, they really mean God the Son. When they talk about Messiah, they actually mean Yahweh or Jehovah in the flesh. What do you make of that sort of redefinition of what the whole issue was about, with these countless councils and debating of the early church you have studied? What do you make of that redefinition of today?
Well, I guess I keep thinking this is a tragic result, because one of the things that it does is that it splits Judaism and Christianity, and also Islam and Christianity. It splits them in a way that was much more profound than anything else that had happened, and much more profound than it needed to be. So that, for example, among some Jews that I know, that I talk with about these things, for a long time, because of the persecution of Jews in Europe, and particularly, if you talk to Jews about Jesus, they don't want to hear about it. Most of them say, no, that's too much. He made too much trouble for us. His people made too much trouble for us, that we can't, we don't even want to talk about that. But that has really changed in some ways. And I'm not talking about I'm not talking necessarily about so how should I put this? The idea that Jesus was, at the very least, a great prophet, and maybe more than that, is not something today that will shock Jews the way it did when I was young, or the Jews of my parents' generation, who were just, managed coming out of World War II. That's not a kind of argument that interested them at that point. But But today there's more and more of a tendency to talk about. One of the rabbis has written a book called "Jesus, My Brother," um, which is a whole different mindset, and something that might have happened a lot earlier had it not been for this sort of, in some ways, a kind of strange development in which the same Christian faith that kind of takes over the Roman Empire converts itself into a religion that in some ways is a new that is a religion in which God isn't unitary anymore. He's Trinity. He's a composite. The idea that somebody had said, I forget it who said, that the problem with the Trinitarian doctrine was not so much that Jesus became God, as that God became Jesus. That it altered the definition of God to the point that now somebody who is a Jew, or at least a non-Trinitarian Christian, would say, this doesn't feel right to me at all. That's not the God that we started to worship, that we learned to worship, and which is meaning no disrespect to Jesus, or not to lower him below the status of a uniquely holy person.
Right. And you wrote to me, Doctor, and you said that this whole controversy, this whole Trinitarian issue that you looked at, really resulted in I think you called it an abandonment of the apocalyptic faith, an abandonment of what you just spoke about, of this change in the millennial, what we Christians call the millennium age, or the age to come, as Judaism calls it. What did you mean by that? That the Trinity controversy resulted in an abandonment of all that, to us, a beautiful Jewish story, right? That God would one day bring the kingdom of God on earth.
Yeah, and well, you can see the abandonment in some ways when Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome, and then it redefines itself in apocalyptic terms, or in non-apocalyptic terms. It redefines itself as that faith that will help make the Roman Empire stronger and Roman individuals better. I mean, it's still an ambitious faith, but the ambition is all to take place within the context of the kind of power and the kind of law and the kind of violence that Rome was famous for. So, to begin with, we know that Augustus, that the Emperor Augustus called himself the Son of God, and that he also called himself the Prince of Peace, and that he claimed that by establishing the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, and building good roads and helping civilize people, he was in a sense, he was carrying out the will of the gods. So you see, I mean, a lot of the best scholarship now on early Christianity, on first and second century Christianity, is being done by people who are now very sensitive to the fact that Jesus himself and the first generations of Christians were anti-Roman. They were not saying Rome could be a lot better. Let's help help kind of, it wasn't Romanism with a human face, was not what this was about. It was about a different sort of place, a place where people wouldn't dream of going to the gladiatorial fights, for example. A place where you wouldn't have half the young men in the empire and fighting in legions in some other place to extend Roman power. And people were happy about the Roman. I mean, Paul was happy about that there were good roads for him to travel on to do his work and so forth. But he never for a minute mistook Rome for God's kingdom.
So you're saying that the early Christians, and this is what you're working on now,
Yeah.
with Paul. So
Yeah.
you're saying that for those early Christians like Paul and his contemporaries, they were not social justice warriors. They were not how do we make Rome better, right? They were all about this thing they call the kingdom of God, and warning people that God's judgment is coming upon the nations, and you better change how you think and how you see the world. So is that what you're saying? They were not social justice activist warriors. They
No,
were more
I'm
about something else.
no, I'm saying they were the real social justice warriors. I mean, that they were not they weren't Roman reformists. They weren't thinking about let's have the let's and it was quite clear what power was and how it operated. I mean, we know that, for example, that Constantine the Great, right, the first Christian emperor, delayed being baptized until he was on his deathbed. Why did he delay being baptized? Because he was going to kill his wife and his children. I mean, he knew he was going to have to do that kind of thing to maintain power in the way that power in those days was maintained. So, and he didn't want to do that and be damned, So, so it seems to me that, but then what happens is, if you kind of lose sight of the fact that the apocalypse means that, or that the world to come means a radically more just, more peaceful and holier world, then you can become more comfortable with the idea of saying, well, God and the Father and Son are up in heaven, and we're down here, and we'll all do the best we can. And maybe the second coming, maybe it'll come, but maybe never. Maybe who knows when. And sort of that giving up on when you give up on Jesus as the Messiah, which it seems to me is what's happening there. You give up on Jesus the Messiah, you're also giving up on a vision of a radically better world, or you're postponing it indefinitely. I mean, it must have been a very hard thing for everybody when the change that was hoped for didn't take place as quickly as it had hoped that it would be.
And it's quadruply hard 2,000 years later for us still waiting for the kingdom.
Right.
Let me ask you as we wrap up here, Professor, I don't want to keep you too long. You wrote to me that this world to come, this beautiful image, Jewish image, right? From the prophets, from the writings, is also about how the dead would be raised, right? And would inherit immortality, would inherit, as the New Testament calls it, life in the age to come. Now, I want to ask you about the resurrection belief. Now, there is this running theme in liberal scholarship, in Christian liberalism, let's call it, that the idea of a resurrection of the dead was only a late sort of Israelite Jewish thing, that it came about especially after the Babylonian exile, and that they were influenced by Babylonian ideas of the afterlife. do you know from your research if the idea of a resurrection of the just and the unjust, as Jesus calls it in the New Testament, is that a wholly original ancient Israelite idea? Can we find that going back to the Pentateuch, the five books, the books of Moses and all that, or?
You know, I don't know. I think it's an important question, and one that I promised to look up and talk to you about again, but I really don't know. I mean, I know that it was a Pharisaic belief that the resurrection of the body. But I think that before that, there was the idea of the resurrection of the dead was, I think it's older than that. But whether it took the form of the resurrection of the body, I really don't know. I think certainly one of the most interesting things about it to me is the resurrection debate and doctrine is that it represents a a, a clear statement of values that death is not a good thing. It's not. But when you see among the liberals as well as non-liberals, but when you see the strong tendency to say, well, that's you're going to have life, you're going to have death, and it's really not worth talking about. There's something that is coming out of Judaism and Christianity both that says, no, wait a minute, we don't accept death any more than we accept sin as part of God's original plan. And I know that the rabbis taught something like this, but this is why I want to look this up and talk to you again about it. I know that the rabbis talked about this in the Talmud also, but so the idea that death is really an evil, not just the part of the law of nature. It seems to me comes down to us and makes us think that if you're going to really be, if you're really going to be talking about transformation, the idea that you simply accept death as one of the, as inevitability, then you might as well say you accept the empire as an inevitability. You accept violence, organized violence as an inevitability, or you expect people to commit crimes and fail morally as an inevitability. So anyway, I think there's something that
Right.
there's something absolutely interesting.
So we must do a part 3 then on on this, God willing. Just to close it up here, Professor, tell what else would you like to say about your current work on Paul? The themes or ideas you're exploring, a little synopsis, maybe even a title if you want to give us a breaking news.
Well, I'm actually I took as a subject of this book the fact that the book of Acts tells us that Paul was shipwrecked in Malta. And I've spent a lot of time in Malta, and I love the country and the people. And the Maltese are very excited about the fact that Paul was there, although there are only about 2 or 3 sentences in the book of Acts that say what he was doing there. So I thought it would be interesting to try to imagine what he was doing there and write about this in the form of a novel, and to talk in particular about his apocalyptic beliefs, which we already have discussed, and to talk about what kind of a person he must have been, because he was the great organizer of the movement, of the Christian movement, and because his views have become ever more controversial and are more disputed maybe now than ever. And in particular, the fact that there are only 6 or 7 letters that are authentic Pauline letters, and the rest, there's a whole question about which of the letters that are say by Paul or he actually wrote. But he's such a passionate believer, and he believes so strongly that the world to come is going to come. That I just I just have been fascinated by him and want to pursue this further. So that's at the moment that's about as much as I can say about it.
Great, and I look forward to it, and expect a signed copy in my in my mail. And thank you so much, Professor, for your time. And any last words out there to our viewers?
No, I will just I'm very happy to be here again. Especially, I think that Carlos is one of the great reviewers, the great interviewers on these topics that I know of, and it's always a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, thank you, Professor. You're a joy to converse with. Again, get this book. This is a must book, I'm telling you. This is all about history, historical facts here about the early councils and all the goings on there, as the professor has told us. Thank you once again, Professor. Keep safe, keep healthy up there in Virginia.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.